Today's themes, obviously a stock taking of the war in the Ukraine with a little bit of history behind it, because I think sometimes it's easy to forget the origin story of where we are now. Update on NATO, which has changed like night and day in the last half a year. An energy security update, because of course in many ways that's been the impact of the first two. Quick snapshot of the consequences of the market disruptions and the supply chain contractions we've seen. Further prognostication, if possible, on what we've seen just in the last couple of days. And we've seen, I think, once again, another turning point. Just an update also on the UK upheavals, equally volatile, but in a different measure. And that I hope try to end on a positive note, if possible, as to where the UK might be going in terms of its rebuilding its relationship with the European Union and vice versa. So with your historical hats on and pens at the ready, do remember that the 24th of February this year didn't come out of nowhere. It has been borne out, I think, really for decades and decades, but I'm going to put a pin in 2014 and simply remind you that at the end of February that year, we saw, of course, the invasion of the Crimean Peninsula by Russian forces in a lightning-fast operation. And the same use of military aligned with referendums, which is very much, I think, the pro-Russian approach to managing authorities in that particular referendum. You'll remember Brussels, Washington, most of the international organizations lined up and said that this was an illegal and illegitimate referendum. But the problem is, I think at this point, things cooled off. We didn't actually see a strong, targeted spate of sanctions rolled out at that time. We saw a few sort of drips. We saw, condemnation in the press largely, so it's sort of paper-based diplomacy more than anything. And we saw really very little push from NATO at that point. There was a sort of grudging acceptance that perhaps the Crimea was simply going to flip over. And that's perhaps, that was a very key mistake at that point. 2017, just to remind you that really for 20 years now, the Ukraine has been labeled as a neighborhood country for the European Union. So there's a whole circle, if you like, of neighborhood countries, including Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, that run right down the spine, if you like, of the European Union, right across the Middle East and right across North Africa. And this is what the EU terms its neighborhood, and wants desperately, obviously, to make relations with economic trade relations, political relations as well. And the type of agreements they come up with are called association agreements. So these are for countries, some of whom will never want to be members of the European Union, some perhaps with membership in mind, and it's a very, very slow process. So in 2017, the Ukraine-EU association was concluded on trade, on visa mobility, as you might remember, on bringing them into the sort of European space in terms of investment, education as well. So it became an Erasmus recipient. And effectively what was launched was the DCFTA, Deep and Comprehensive Free Trade Agreement. And that's really considerable. That is bringing the Ukraine economically into the European Union. And that's interesting because that sort of begins to differentiate what integration actually means. Can you bring a whole member state into a union without making them a political member? And possibly in 20 years that question might come back to Britain as to what else you might be able to do in terms of moving out and possibly moving back in again. Just waiting for the clicker. This year, of course, we had a bit of a warning. Actually, we really had warnings from December onwards, and most of us, took them seriously. But I think even then, we were surprised, at the speed of what happened from the 21st as well. So you'll remember that on the 21st, Putin very clearly stands up and gives a couple of speeches. The first one on this day, recognizing Luhansk and Donetsk as independent states, sovereign, independent states with Russian minorities in them that he's happy to defend. And that, of course, starts the sanction ball rolling from the Western powers and a whole slew of heightened preparations, chiefly by the Ukrainian military, obviously. The word that continues to be used, obviously, for the war, which is an illegal word to use at this point, as you know, in Russia, is the special military operation. And Putin's suggestion was that this was necessary to completely rebuild the region and primarily to defeat what he called and has labeled ever since as the neo-Nazi Ukrainian government. Of course, a claim undermined by all of the international community. And then on the 24th, the tanks rolled in and the missiles started pounding various areas. And I think what was perhaps most frightening at that point is they got very close to Kiev very, very quickly. And I think the sense was that this was going to move very, very fast as well. So the military operation sending direct units into Ukraine. What has happened, I think, since, one of the lodestars of the operation is that NATO cannot assist directly. And that's been a problem, I think, in many ways, and it's hard to accept that. But it has to stand by the principle that because Ukraine isn't possibly yet a member of NATO, it can the best it can do is marshal a huge indirect operation, and it has. My goodness, it has, and we can talk about that. The European Union, I think, has changed. Because I think initially it stood behind the sort of NATO bulwark and said, we can't either. But within a couple of weeks, they had changed their minds and said, actually, we can. We are going to help them directly. We're going to send lethal weapons directly to the Ukraine. And in a way, it's easier for them. They can probably make a market-based decision there, where the NATO obviously is a collective defense organization bound by the charter, which makes it that much more difficult. So we can talk a little bit about it. If you think back about how things have changed in terms of the warfare, we've seen a lot of plans, A's, B's, C's, and D's sort of rolled out from the Kremlin. Some have not gone to plan, and some have as well. So we can talk a little bit in a minute about counteroffensives. But if you can remember, the initial objectives in February was really just to sort of, as I have the quote here, just to cut the head off the Ukrainian government completely and just render the entire country null and void. But that actually didn't come to pass through a variety of miscalculations, chiefly with the hardware. Actually, I think that the Russians attempted to use not quick enough, not reliable enough, difficult to repair, didn't work in the winter conditions. So very, very poor planning, surprisingly poor planning, I think, from that perspective as well. So Daniel Free, the former senator, a senior State Department, suggested the quick decapitation of the Ukrainian government didn't work. Now Putin just wants to pound them because they're resisting and must be purged. It's Stalin-esque. At this point, you begin to get a sort of shift of what the Russian military really wants at this point. Is it going to be, continued bombardment, or are they going to row back a bit and start being a little bit more discerning about what they can legitimately do? Is it going to be a bit more targeted? So indiscriminate or targeted? And I think what we saw from March to April was both sides kind of settling in, bedding down into sort of siege tactics, and it became less sort of offensive and much more about almost World War I sort of attrition tactics, just finding your area on the ground and defending it. The continued sort of indiscriminate pummeling of cities took place, but always on the periphery for the most part. And I think by that point, the Ukrainians had figured out, just how to be able to discern it ahead of time and to be prepared to be able to push it back as well. This is also the point. You get a sort of counterbalance. You get a political impasse and you get a military impasse. That's the first time the negotiations started creeping onto the table. And Zelensky saying, I'm prepared to come to the negotiating table. I might talk about neutrality. Remember that in the news? And Putin saying, well, we can talk about it. And the suggestion that those 2 provinces and then eventually those 4 might come under the status of a sort of organized governance framework agreed by both sides. But that did not stay. Just a reminder also, because we saw this in the clip at the beginning, of the enormous number of people displaced internally within Ukraine, millions and millions, and the incredible number of Ukrainians who have left Ukraine and gone further abroad into Europe and to the United Kingdom and other areas as well. So 14.5 million now at last count. That is an extraordinary series of numbers. You're getting to sort of quite well beyond post-World War II migration statistics there. And the question is, what's going to happen? Where will they go? I mean, we've seen some pretty good integration. I think Poland has borne the brunt of this for the most part. Is it going to be happy to continue to do so? What does that mean for the government of Poland and Ukraine as well? We've also seen, I think, tremendous work by international organizations, which remind us, particularly from a political science perspective, how desperately important it is to have responsive organizations in Europe, in the European Union. And I think you can't really see it, but what you are seeing is probably the best cooperation between NATO and the European Union as well, on things like humanitarian rescue packages too. You're all familiar, of course, with the point of sanctions. From a foreign policy perspective, they rest on a spectrum, if you like. You've got hard power tools on the one side, and then you've got media on the other, sort of soft power. And sanctions have always sort of bubbled away somewhere in the middle if they're very, very focused and hard. The material impact they have on the recipient can feel very hard power indeed, and I think should be categorized as that. Sometimes it's more about the optics of saying, look how many people join our sanctions club. You know, we're prepared to be very ruthless. Everybody in the world is backing this, and we're going to make it cross-sector. I think cross-sectoral impact is the key characteristic that we can see with regards to the sanctions against Russia. It's in absolutely every area. So finance and banking and investment, but also raw materials and chiefly energy as well. So it's trying to find out the way in which Russia was, in many ways, embedded into the world economy and trying to at least, if not cut off, then certainly pause the majority of what those connective strands look like as well. So everything from prohibition on imports of iron and steel to gas and petroleum, etc. I think the one that brought everybody together, as you might remember, is the SWIFT messaging system. So it's as much to do with the software of global finance, you know, as it is to do with the hardware as well. And I think for the first few months it clearly had an impact. Then there was an upswing, I think, in Russian GDP, and now there's been a massive decline as well. So we'll have to see. I've got a number of map slides, as you might expect. This is the look in late April, when the majority of the southeast of the country was completely under Russian military control. But already, even then, clear examples of Ukrainian counteroffensive, starting up in Kharkiv, and that's, of course, Kharkiv and Kherson being the first place that we saw the incursions in February as well. Crimea, obviously, absolutely at the heart of the operation, and probably the place that Russia will want to be dislodged from the last, and will fight the hardest, I think, to retain, along with Kherson as well. So I will come back just to show you what the change has been. The developments were very political, I think, for June and July. We had an upsurge in interest with Finland and Sweden saying yes, they were going to shift their historical neutral status and join NATO, which I think came as quite a shock, actually. It certainly caused a huge amount of feather spitting in some areas of NATO in Europe. But more interestingly and more importantly, I think, was the very simple, incredibly swift yes to accession by the European Union, and that had to go through the European Council, where all the heads of states meet together. And I think that the sense that formal accession, you know, would begin was so swiftly given simply on the basis of the alignment of Ukraine's norms and values. But those had been laid out before. That's not as a result of the war. Those had been laid out in the association agreement. So the sort of patient work, for the most part, done by Europe on one side and Ukraine on the other, can really be traced back to the 2000s, I think, to post end of the Cold War, and then the ability to sort of, you know, press the button. Let's be under no illusions. It's going to take a long, long time. Think how long it took for the Central and Eastern countries to join in 2004 and 2007, and even that seemed a bit of a rush job. Ukraine is not going to be able to join in a hurry. We're not talking about next year. I would be astonished if it's, you know, really within 5. I think it's more likely within 10. We're going to have to comprehensively rebuild the state, top down and bottom up, including every single sector as well. And the idea of it, you know, coming into the European Union sort of half-formed isn't going to do Ukraine any good, and it's not going to do the European Union any good as well. The shift also, I think, in Germany is remarkable. 2 major shifts, actually. One, that has caused a constitutional rethink, quite frankly, about sending over lethal weapons and really being the heart, for the first time ever, of European security and defense paradigm, which it really hasn't before. It's always cooperated with the sort of small ops, but to agree to be the driving force behind the European and security terrain, that's very, very new as well. I think, and I'll come back to this has caused a real scrambling in Brussels. There's a variety of mechanisms and tools to help Europe have a foreign policy and be a global diplomatic actor. And a lot of those have sort of bubbled away quietly. Now, it has a serious opportunity to make those real if it wants to, and it has to decide what that looks like. If it's going to be, is it going to be pulled by France and pushed by Germany? And I'll talk briefly at the end about the European political community, or is it going to be pushed by external events? This is always the question Europe has faced. Is it being driven internally or is it being pulled externally as well? In September, early September, we see a counteroffensive. We've seen about 5 of them since the beginning of September. Zelensky announcing that armed forces had retaken a huge chunk, almost overnight, 2,000 square kilometers southeast via northeastern counteroffensive. And just on day 200, it's always nice when these things have a sort of calendar to them, the Russian army forced to pull back thousands of troops and leave a huge swathe of hardware behind as well, following a series of battlefield defeats. Trying to bring it up to date in the last couple of days, and I've had to send copious amounts of slide updates to poor Will back there, who's just usually sees an email from me and just puts his heads in his hands and wonders what the update is now. The sabotage we've seen of the 2 Nord Stream pipelines has not helped matters. It's provided a terrific amount of unrestricted methane to spill out into the North Sea, which takes years to break down. So you've got a massive, climate change and ecological issue to deal with. So the Danes and the Swedes are going to be looking at how that happened and what to mop up in terms of their own economic zones as well. So the pipelines are not operational, but they are full of gas. So when you set detonators underneath and they explode, I mean, what do you expect is going to happen? You've got a large amount of methane, as I said, and I think it was categorized almost instantly as an act of sabotage requiring the strongest possible response. This is by NATO, this is by the European Union. Interestingly, the Danes and the Swedes were a little bit cautious about how they wanted to categorize the attack in terms of their economic zone. But I think we're under no illusion that it certainly looks like a sort of salted earth policy to make very, very sure that those pipelines can't be used in a hurry, at any rate, in the next couple of years as well. Interestingly, the day after, the Polish and the Danish prime ministers had a photo taken of opening a valve on a brand new pipeline, more pipelines. The Baltic pipeline bringing Norwegian gas across Denmark and the Baltic Sea to Poland, so that's been under construction for years now, but the idea to make it a going concern is very interesting. And then almost 24 hours later, the announcement by Moscow of formally annexing, as they said, the 4 provinces, the first 2 that really started the whole upheaval in 2014, Donetsk and Luhansk, but then pulling along the southern region of Kherson and Zaporizhia as well. Very quick snap referenda, exactly the way we've seen before, allowing Russia to really retain that toehold politically. And, for Putin to say the words we really don't want him to say, we're prepared to defend these areas by any means necessary. So I think there's a sense of tremendous tightening of the strategic knot there, the question of what particular weapons might be deployed, and the obvious response in terms of the European Union and NATO as well. My worry is that this part of the world in general has seen a lot of cold conflicts. The end may never be in sight. We may have a permanent war along that 4-region strip. You have frozen conflicts all over, littering that area. There may simply never be an end in sight. I think perhaps that's the sad truth, unless there can be a categoric and indefensible method of getting ahead on that. So sorry, it's a little bit blurry, but this is the sort of map that makes me very, very excited. Lots and lots of pipelines crisscrossing east-west and increasingly north-south across the European heartland. You can see the sort of east-west dynamic with pipelines, major pipelines extending from Russia right the way to the key gas hubs in Germany and Austria and across to the Netherlands as well. And you can see in red and in green, Nord Stream 1 started in 2006, Nord Stream 2 started a few years afterwards. And the artery, the sort of hard power artery that these pipelines provide, and the way in which obviously they link countries together and markets together as well. If those are out of the equation now, where does that leave Europe? It leaves it in a bit of a pickle. It's on British time. So what has happened to NATO? tremendous change, really, overall. We expected them to move quickly. We expected them to corral and work in a cooperative way, and I think for the most part they did. So it's a sort of weapons party, if you like. They've had to build together and bring together all of the weapons that are volunteered to NATO. NATO doesn't own them. They're volunteered by their states, and they have to be used very, very quickly. Here's a nice snapshot of the increasingly strong eastern flank, stretching from Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, now very much bulked up by the possibility of Sweden and Finland jumping on board in the next couple of months as well. So you've got a curtain descending on Europe again, in many, many ways, and you've got a frozen conflict in Ukraine. And I cannot help but feel this historically, we've been here before. It might not be regressive, but it's very, very familiar. I think what's interesting is the European injection into NATO. And you may all feel, well, of course it's European anyway. It is, but in many ways it's a European forum operated by and directed by America. And that was, of course, the key point. But what has changed now, I think, is a clear indication that Europe needs to be ready more quickly, justifiably more quickly in terms of troops and in terms of hardware as well. So the green light given in June 2020 for this European force model sees the highest number of troops ever put together on deployment by Europe, and to assign them to strategic areas ahead of time, not just to wait for something that goes boom and to send the troops in, but to think strategically. And again, you might think, my goodness, isn't this what NATO does? Not really, actually. Generally, there's a strong HQ in Brussels and this sort of hub and spoke approach. You send out the troops where they're needed, only when they're needed, not anymore. There is a preemptive dynamic that we're seeing filtering into NATO thought and perhaps enlargement with regards to Sweden and Finland that we've simply not seen before. So 3 tiers in terms of the rollability, if you like, of troops available in as quickly as 10 days, 10 to 30 days, and quite possibly as many as 500,000 troops with 1 to 6 months. 500,000 in the next 6 months if NATO's tier 3, if they agree to it, is to have its way. A counterattack cannot wait for US reinforcements, must be undertaken with European forces. It is sobering, certainly. In terms of the impact of commodities, I think most of you are very familiar with this, but the main impact, of course, has been farming. Because of Ukraine's sheer size, the quality of arable farming that Ukraine lends agriculture across the European Union as a whole is absolutely enormous. And perhaps it went unsung and unrealized until the exports stopped. So grain and wheat and potatoes as well. So what's now categorized effectively as the zone of risk farming, meaning nothing can be sown, nothing can be reaped, nothing can be exported. And I think that decimation is important, as well as the impact that's going to have going forward. And of course, it's connected, and a lot of the organizations, many of which you mentioned this morning, are involved in trying to ship things, trying to find replacements, trying to come to agreements. Turkey brokered one of them to get ships out of Odessa, bearing Ukraine grain and wheat, etc. The UN got involved, as you might remember, in June and then again in September, saying very clearly that the impact was going to be global. It wasn't just going to be a local Ukrainian issue or even a regional issue for the European Union as a whole to try to work with. You've got a serious food shortage, already exacerbated by the stretched supply chains and the underwhelmed economies, if you like, of post-COVID and even post-Brexit to some extent. And now, you could tip this into a food shortage-driven worldwide recession. What does that mean? And are we prepared for it? Might not be thrilling to you, but it's important to bear in mind in terms of the pipeline of things here. Fertilizer, without that, obviously you can't get the food to grow. And the impact this has obviously had in terms of energy. The packages of sanctions have reflected this, I think, which is interesting, the ability to try to find replacements while trying to sanction Russia's ability to export, because of course Russia's a huge exporter too, including of energy and fertilizer as well. In fact, it's the top supplier of certain fertilizers and natural gas. So the problem with sanctions, obviously, is you use them to indicate your displeasure at something diplomatic happening or military happening, but will have an immediate impact, as we've all seen, on the type of market that you're already used to. So it's a double-edged sword, ladies and gentlemen, as are most things in politics. Be very careful with sanctions, because frequently they will come back to bite you. The idea, I think, is targeted and short-term and very, very visceral, if you like. But if you keep that on for months and months and months and you don't have a backup plan, it can create problems, and I think we've seen that as well. So just beginning to wind down a little bit here. We've seen the annexation, as I've mentioned, of Ukrainian regions. Is Putin passing a point of no return? Quite possibly. Is he going to lock it down? Maybe. I think we'll have to see if there are any further sense of negotiations. I just don't think that's going to happen, before the winter sets in as well. Zelensky said Russia is annexing itself to a catastrophe. Moscow will get no new territory now, and that's a very different flag that he was flying since March and April again. Europe has had to completely remake its energy market, completely. The sense of not just having a gas cap, but making itself completely not dependent anymore, and it had been for many, many years, on any form of Russian gas and oil is extraordinary. It's a long time coming. Many would say it's fantastically overdue, but it's here now. Let's see what it does in terms of building a genuine European energy union, an actual union that would sit on top of the political union. How does that supercharge the concept of European foreign policy as well? I've worked for years on trying to identify whether the European Union wants to become a sort of peacemaking union, sort of island of peace, which was very much the philosophy by which it was set up, or a fighty EU. Since 2016, there have been a series of projects to try to really uplift the European Union. None of them have been galvanized to the extent, I think, that the Russian invasion of Ukraine has as well. So the update, obviously, for the last couple of days, more Ukrainian counteroffensives moving very quickly along the Dnieper River, trying to get ahead of the weather, I think, almost as much as anything else. Over the weekend, the attack on the Kerch Bridge, bombing probably from above and below, not a truck bomb, as previously seen, on a highly symbolic, as well as very militarily important area, that artery at the bottom of the Crimea that links to the Russian mainland, making it virtually impossible, at least for the next couple of days, for the Russian troops to move quickly abroad and abroad. And of course, in the last couple of days, yesterday, in fact, Russian forces carrying out mass strikes in civilian areas at rush hour. In the majority of Ukrainian cities as well. And so if you were watching the news last night and yesterday, you've seen the international condemnation and opprobrium. Von der Leyen herself was on the news this morning saying they were targeted reprisals. So I'm sure you know it, but this is where they try not to do this without falling off the stage. This is that's the bridge there, the Kerch Bridge. And the pushback, I think, has been considerable that we've seen in terms of the Ukrainian counteroffensive. It's whether he can hold on to it. Okay, let's shift now to the joy of UK political economy. Absolutely my favorite. It's exactly the right thing that we should be doing this morning. Trussonomics, I'll try to do this objectively, not too much tongue-in-cheek, but it has been an extraordinary period. I can hear the titters in the room, yes. It's very difficult to actually put it on a slide. So I've done a sort of good news, bad news thing. Let's start with the good news. Let's do that. Yes, I was delighted to see Truss U-turn, how strange, to attend the European Political Community inauguration in Prague on the 6th of October. EPC's been in the works for some time. People say it's the brainchild of Macron. Not exactly. It's a Macron-Merkel agreement, actually, if you go back far enough. And I think the idea of putting a club of non-EU members together, giving them time and space to talk about energy security, Russia, climate change, but also where Europe is going with and without its members is very, very important. Came along at just the right time as well. So she toddled off to Prague and, duly shook hands, but I think did a pretty diplomatically decent job of indicating British interest in not necessarily working with, but maybe calibrating, maybe recalibrating where Britain, in terms of foreign policy, wants to sit alongside its European neighbours as well. There was a suggestion that Britain might host the second EPC. That's very interesting. If that goes ahead, that does suggest a real warming of relations, but not unlike COP26, it's a great opportunity for Britain to play sort of summit shopping and to bring people into Britain and demonstrate once again what a great leader it is as well. So let's see if that happens. Interesting warming of relations with France. You remember that Truss couldn't quite make her mind up over Macron. She's happily changed her mind on that now. So hurrah for Anglo-French relations. I'm interested in this because you have a number of crucial treaties between Britain and France, not least a few nuclear ones. So if she can pay attention to the Lancaster House treaties and have a look as to what these look like post-Brexit, because that's not been done yet, I think that would be an admirable use of time. And of course, the idea that Britain now is a member of something called PESCO, Permanent Enhanced Structured Cooperation, which is, again, a non-EU club within the European Union for states to cooperate on defence. Incredibly important, a wonderful place for Britain to jump into post-Brexit as well. Bad news, we'll call it the fiscal event, obviously, because that's what Kwarteng referred to it to, the kamikaze budget. I think it was a complete disaster from beginning to end, but if people want to disagree, they're welcome to. No, nobody's going to. Large and untargeted energy bailout of households and businesses, seemingly unfunded tax cuts to income tax. I loved the question that Beth Rigby posed to Truss about if she was having trouble refinancing her mortgage, or even indeed what a mortgage is, and that didn't go down particularly well. The incredible selling of government, bonds and the plummeting of the UK pound. I think this has come back a little bit, but it's more the increase in government borrowing costs. That's I think what's going to be incredibly eye-watering, as well as the loosening, as it's now been called. I remember times when it was easing, but fiscal loosening seems to work for me. It's, and particularly hearing over the last couple of days, it's growth, growth, growth. That seems to be the abiding philosophy of the Truss government at this point. And it's beginning to divide people. I think it's a degree of division. It's growth versus anti-growth. Are you on board the growth train? Are you supporting us in terms of how we want to grow Britain? And if you don't sort of line up with my philosophy, you're on the anti-growth train. So it's again, a divisiveness. It's a polarization tactic. George, you and I were talking about this a little bit before. So I'd like to, sort of throw that out there and get your opinions on that as well. Now, maybe tax cuts and higher interest rates, will provide a bit of inward investment and make it cheaper for people to invest in Britain, maybe. But it's not going to sustainably drive growth. It's not going to solve growth issues. And I think effectively that's what she needed. So just to finish off a little bit on where the UK can go, rebuilding bridges with the European Union. Obviously, sadly, it's kind of bittersweet, but it is true. The war in the Ukraine has given Britain the opportunity to put the wiring back in with Brussels. It has allowed it a seat at the top table. It has actually done very well, I think, in providing a degree of leadership. It has worked well with its NATO allies. It continues to be a strong force. But all of this has been very much on the fly, and it's been reactively driven. What's going to happen in terms of how we rebuild Ukraine? What role does that give Britain in terms of working with its EU partners, having been incredibly clear that it wants to deinstitutionalize everything to do with the European Union, and has done so in terms of Brexit as well. The next big, spat, obviously, will be the ongoing one, the Northern Ireland Protocol as well. This has destabilized and rendered toxic relations both between the Northern and Southern Ireland, but between Ireland and Britain and Brussels. So you've got a sort of unhappy triangle, if you like, as well. I think there's a sense that you can redo the protocol, you can rework it, and you make it incredibly light touch. I've always hoped that would be the case, because if the goods are going through Northern Ireland and they're staying in the Republic of Ireland, they are not coming back, into the European Union single market as well. So I think you really can afford to be far more light touch in terms of the goods and phytosanitary checks. It can be done. I think there's just not the political will at this point. If the protocol is scrapped, it would be very popular in some areas, Dublin, Brussels, and Washington, but Truss risks, obviously, a backlash from the fairly hardline Tory European Research Group. Having said that, last week I was puzzled, but delighted to see Steve Baker, who is one of the strident voices of the EPG, saying it was time for humility to work with European colleagues, and that maybe Brexit hadn't produced sort of sheaf and basket of goods as well, and that it was time to work more emphatically and more authentically with Europe. Isn't that good? You always see things 2020 in retrospect, exactly. So I've just said there are a few benefits, I think, to maybe reworking it. I don't think Article 16 is going to be triggered, but you can certainly come up with an entirely rational, light touch approach to animal and food safety as well. So, final thoughts, and then we can roll on into the Q&A. EU enlargement. After about 10 years of it being not on the table, it's firmly back on the table. This will delight, I think, states in the Balkans, which is fantastic for them. But it's going to be tricky because, of course, the European Union has said yes to Ukraine. It's also said yes to Moldova, where a huge number of Ukrainians, of course, have migrated. Moldova is in even worse shape than Ukraine. And there were other states, Black Sea states, if I can call them this, that asked first. Georgia is much, much further down the accession pipeline than Ukraine. There's even a sense, I think, that more support could be given to Armenia, for example. So you've got enlargement. What type of enlargement? Full-scale enlargement? Or is it this sort of accession agreement, enlargement light, if you like, that the European Union has, done pretty well in for the most part? Can you bring Ukraine and not Moldova? Can you bring Ukraine and Moldova and not Georgia? Where are the natural borders of Europe? And, who's to say, where those should legitimately lie and for how long as well? Obviously, there's a question about what other undersea cables might be targeted. Nord Stream is one thing. It's big and it's obvious, and you can clearly blow it up pretty easily, but there is an absolute forest. There's a thicket of cables that carry very, very precious, internet connections and communications running underneath. And if those are targeted, we're going to have a serious problem, at least in terms of being able to respond to those quickly. The strategic compass is the most recent product by the European Union for a rebooted foreign policy. And at its heart now, and it certainly wasn't before, is energy security. So my guess is that being a strong and sustainable and self-sufficient energy power, if you like, that's the new stage of European foreign policy. We're going to be, energy autonomous, if you like. Very difficult to do in practice, but I'm intrigued that that's been moved into the very heart of what now represents the European Union's foreign policy as well. NATO development I've already shown you, but I think the whole idea is to make it very, very easy for the United States to know that Europe is okay, it can take care of itself. If it then, the US, has to deal with a two-front battle, Russia, possibly militating in other areas of the world, and China at the same time. So the idea of sort of muscling up NATO makes a lot of sense, I think. Migration, I touched on this before. What happens when, migrants want to quite reasonably go back to their homeland? Very, very tricky to kind of support that. And also what happens if migration begins to unspool within the countries they've already gone to, making it a real lightning rod for the whole rise of populist parties that we've seen, not least in Italy. That is just simmering, and you could easily see that explode as well. I mentioned energy security. I'll finish with a fun fact that the number and structure, if you like, of democracies has been steadily declining, sadly, in the past 20 years. We don't defend it and we don't define it as clearly as we ought to. And nature abhors a vacuum in its space. We've seen the rise, either of populist parties, specific parties within a democracy, or the complete collapse of democracy, and authoritarian structures, impulses, or governments, replacing those as well. I think that's something that really leaders of all stripes need to be aware of.